LDL cholesterol. This is a metric that's on any basic lipid panel. And I would say that, within that basic lipid panel, this is probably the most important value, the one that you should be paying the most attention to. But this is debated within the nutrition space, especially on social media. And for that reason, I want you to lay out for the audience, what are the lines of evidence we can look to evaluate the role that LDL-C is playing in the risk of cardiovascular disease? I mean, is there enough there from different areas for us to look at this and say high LDL-C is causal in cardiovascular disease?
Right. So just let's just clarify, just in case somebody's not clear on what LDL cholesterol is versus LDL, because they're very different things and they're
Yes.
very commonly confused, even by scientists and doctors. It's very natural to confuse these things. The scientists did not help us with the terminology. All these things sound the same. It's all confusing. So LDL is the lipoprotein, the carrier of different types of fat. So LDL stands for low density lipoprotein. And LDL cholesterol is the cholesterol traveling inside that lipoprotein. So the analogy we use in the videos is a bus and the passengers in the bus. So LDL cholesterol is a type of passenger. The analogy needs to be elaborated a little bit. You need to have a couple different buses and then different passengers within each bus to accommodate for the different types of fat. But basically, the bus would be the LDL for now, and the passengers would be the LDL cholesterol. And then triglycerides would be a different type of passenger. So the question is, what evidence points to or away from LDL cholesterol being causal in cardiovascular disease? So there's three basic pillars, and we're simplifying this a bit. There's a bit more. There's a lot of work in animals, but we'll gloss over that for now. In humans, let's say there's three main pillars. The first pillar is observational, what's called epidemiology, right? So you look at a population, you're not intervening, you're not telling them to do anything. You're just looking at their metrics. In this case, their lipid metrics, and then you're recording their outcomes: who gets heart attacks, who gets strokes, who dies of cardiovascular disease. And then you look for statistical correlations. And when you do that, you see a strong direct correlation between LDL cholesterol levels and cardiovascular risk. People who have higher LDL cholesterol tend to have higher risk. But that's just observational. We know that can be confounded by many different factors. So you want to confirm that with what's called an interventional trial, something where you go in and you tell people to do this and do that. And ideally, you do that randomized. So later in time came the randomized controlled trials with cholesterol-lowering drugs, statins, and then later other classes of drugs. And those drugs powerfully lower LDL cholesterol, and they powerfully lower cardiovascular risk. So that would look to confirm the causality. Then later came genetic experiments, Mendelian randomization, sometimes it's called. And what you do there is you look at people who have genetically determined lower or higher LDL cholesterol levels, and you see if their risk is higher or lower. And there what you see is as well that people who have genetically high LDL cholesterol tend to have more heart disease and vice versa. So it all seems to fit together nicely. Here's the problem. These metrics all affect each other, right? They're not all independent. They're all hermetic. When you change the number of passengers, typically you're changing the number of buses as well, and the number of different types of passengers affects each other. So yeah, in that analogy, if you think about a city trying to manage their transportation system, if you lower the number of buses driving around, there's also going to be less passengers traveling in those buses, because now you have less buses going around, right? And vice versa. If you have suddenly less passengers, probably you're going to cut back on the number of buses because they're just going around empty. You don't need them. The same thing happens with lipids. So those three pillars that we touched on, where we see that nice correlation between LDL cholesterol and risk, which by the way is risk dependent, it's really compelling. The problem is you also see a similar direct correlation with the number of lipoproteins. So the number of LDLs and this thing called ApoB, which I guess we should define that for clarity. ApoB is one protein that tags a class of these lipoproteins. So there's different families of lipoproteins, but LDL belongs to the ApoB carrying lipoproteins, and those are the ones that are atherogenic. And that tag, that ApoB lipoprotein, is really useful because there's only one copy of ApoB, one protein per lipoprotein. So it's really like a license plate, right? It's unique and it's one copy per bus, which is really useful because then we can just measure the number of ApoB proteins and we know how many of these particles are traveling around. So the number of ApoB, which reflects the number of lipoproteins, also correlates really well with risk in those three pillars together with LDL cholesterol. So you, just by looking at that, you can't tell which one is guilty, which one is the culprit, right? Because you got these two people that are always in the crime scenes together. So what you need to do is you need to go look for the exceptions where you can uncouple them, where you need to look for crime scenes where only one of the guys shows up and the other has an alibi, right? So in the observational evidence, you do what's called a discordance analysis. Fancy name, but all it means is you look at the exception, people where LDL cholesterol and ApoB are not traveling together, where maybe they have high cholesterol, high LDL cholesterol, but normal ApoB, or vice versa. And when you do that, you find that the risk tracks with ApoB rather than LDL cholesterol, tracks with the number of lipoproteins rather than the passengers, the content. And then you do similarly for every pillar. With the second pillar, with the cholesterol lowering drugs, most of those famous drugs, the statins, the PCSK9 inhibitors, the ezetimibe, they do lower LDL cholesterol, but they also lower the number of lipoproteins. And what they do, in fact, is they modulate the function of the LDL receptor. When you increase the number of LDL receptors, these little antennae on the surface of hepatocytes, of liver cells, they capture more LDL particles out of circulation, and thereby you're reducing the number of particles in circulation, and you're reducing the total LDL cholesterol in circulation as well. But there are some drugs that play with the concentration or with the amount of LDL cholesterol content, but don't do that, but do not modulate particle number. And those drugs don't do much to risk, right? So there you uncouple that as well. So you see that lowering LDL cholesterol is only beneficial and is only sufficient to improve risk to the extent that you've done that through modulating the number of lipoproteins, not by modulating cholesterol by itself. And then the last pillar, the genetics, same thing. The people that tend to have higher, that have genetically determined higher LDL cholesterol also tend to have genetically determined larger number of LDL lipoproteins. And so there you do also, you look for that exception, and you do something called multivariate analysis, where you ask statistically which metric tracks best with risk. And again, you find when you adjust for lipoprotein number, for particle number, the effect of LDL cholesterol goes away. So when you put everything together, what this is telling us is that LDL cholesterol, it correlates well with risk. It's a useful proxy. It's one analogy we used in one of the videos is that it's the check engine light on your dashboard. So when that comes on, generally, it's a good idea to take a look at the engine. It's not a good idea to drive around for a year or more with the light on. It spells trouble. But it's not perfect, right? You can imagine that the circuitry to the light could be defective and the engine could be about to blow up, but the light is not on, and vice versa. The light could come on because the circuitry is not working perfectly, but the engine is fine. So LDL cholesterol is like that. Most of the time, in most people, if there's a frank elevation, ApoB will also be high. So it's a useful, a useful, metrically useful proxy, but it can fail. And those are the discordant cases, which are about 25% of people, give or take, depending on the study. So it's good to keep in mind always that the real lever that you want to be pulling on at the end of the day of causality is ApoB, is number of lipoproteins. Say.